Well, we're glad to be sharing a lecture in this final week. I have my friend Zac Luben on the call today. So Zac, let's just give the 2-minute intro. You're married, you have a son, and where do you work and serve, and kind of what are some of your leadership roles?
Yeah, I live on Pepperdine University's campus. My wife is an associate director of residence life, and we've lived here six years now. I think we've been back. I did my undergraduate at Pepperdine. Did my finished my graduate degree at Pepperdine. I've been in full time ministry for over 13 years now. I've been at the Culver Palms Church of Christ as their youth and family minister for just over 8 years at this stage, and so live at Pepperdine. I also serve as an adjunct professor in the religion department. I
Mhm.
teach Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. As far as leadership roles outside of ministry, but kind of within that realm, I've been a camp director for SoCal Teen Camp.
Mhm.
I've been a director for King's Camp, which is a 4th through 8th grade camp that runs down here in Southern California. I currently serve as the program director for Crossways, which is our leadership program at Pepperdine for incoming juniors and seniors. We take about 100 students from across the country and bring them out to campus for 9 days, and run them through sort of a vocational discernment program during their time with us. So those are just a few of the roles that I get to have in my variety of fun things that I get to do.
Yeah, and you get to be dad to Jude. How old is Jude now?
4. We turned 4
4.
in March. So
Yeah, yeah. So as you think about just kind of some of your other leadership roles within the youth ministry group that we called the SoCal Youth Ministry Mafia, one of the things you did was you got me my job at the Glendale Church. Um, but there is a lot of other ways that you were kind of influential in that group. And so part of that is why you're on this call, is because you've been a leader in my life. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about how maybe the word leader doesn't capture what we mean by that, but pointing to God and drawing me into a further understanding of what it means to follow Jesus. And so I've appreciated you just kind of sitting at lunch across the table as we share hamburgers. Well, you were probably eating something other than a hamburger, but
yeah, salad or a fish or something like
salad
that.
or
Yeah.
fish or something. Um, yeah, to moments at camp where we're leading students and trying to care for students, to moments where we're sharing about how to be good spouses to our wives and what that means. So I'm thankful for your leadership in my life. Um, what's one aspect of your understanding of leadership that's maybe changed over the years?
Yeah, I think one of the ways that my view of leadership has changed is I really think that like one's moral vision is more important than hard work or even sort of natural leadership skills. And what I've realized is that even in working in youth ministries, you would have a naturally gifted leader, but if that naturally gifted leader doesn't have sort of, I would use the term moral vision, like the 10th grader isn't thinking in terms of that. But if there isn't sort of a coherence for that student that invites that student to lead in a particular direction, they're not really going to be good leaders in the sense that of the way that I want them to be good leaders in the ministry, or the way that I would help them develop, right? I've had a number of students with great leadership skills, and by that I mean they're likable. People want to follow them.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe more than the hard work and leadership skills that we're born with and we can develop and so on and so forth, I think having a strong sense of sort of where you are headed or what is your purpose as a leader actually matters maybe more than some of the things that we really kind of focus in on when we talk about leadership, sort of like getting people to do what you want them to do, or those kinds of things. That's kind of one of the bigger shifts that I've had over the last couple of years, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you think about even the whole thing, if you don't count the cost, right, of the
Right.
tower, then you're just building, even if you got the tower built, maybe it's not useful. Maybe it's not a useful tower.
Right.
Or,
Yeah.
so having some sense of direction. And I think that's an interesting phrase, moral vision, one that's somewhat new to me. So where does that come from? Like, how did you come up with that kind of language?
Yeah. I've been doing a lot of reading, and I've been influenced by Dr. Andrew Root, who's done a lot of work in youth ministry, and he teaches at a Lutheran seminary. But his most recent work has been dealing with Charles Taylor's book, A Secular Age, and one of the books that Root wrote, when he talked about sort of the purpose of youth ministry, he talked about how families have a moral vision. And what I think he means by this is that we all basically function with a narrative or a story that kind of points us towards a good,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And whatever good that is, and in a secular age, there's a lot of different goods, right? There's a plurality of goods.
Mm-hmm.
And so really the invitation is to think about, okay, what does it mean to have a moral vision? Meaning, what is the good that I am working towards,
Mm-hmm.
right? And without sort of that conversation happening, without being able to say, this fits our definition of good, or this fits sort of our direction, um, then sort of the integrity and the ethics kind of go along with that, right?
Yeah.
As long as you sort of have the telos, the ending
Right.
in mind. And the question then, and I think Root does this, which I think is challenging for us as leaders and for families, is being aware of what our moral vision is telling us, or what is the good that we're pursuing, and what is probably more likely, more often than not, is that our moral vision is we don't reflect upon that.
Mm-hmm.
We're not actually reflecting on what is the good. And I think that's true for in leadership, right? So you want to be a good leader. Well, what definition of leadership are you working with?
Right.
Right. And if you
Yeah.
don't have a clear picture of that, then you're just going to kind of bounce around. And we
Yeah.
see this, right? Everyone has a leadership book that you can read.
Yeah.
But unless you have a clear picture of where you're headed or what that means for you as a leader, those books sound great. They just don't necessarily move you forward, I think, in the direction that you may want to go, or it may move you in multiple directions, and that will be confusing.
Yeah. So, and that's part of the foundation of this course, is to ask students to construct their own biblical theology of leadership that should help them become aware, critically aware of what their definition of good leadership is. Not necessarily to give, pat answers or the one go-to definition, but to just say, you're probably operating with some moral vision of what leadership and good leadership is. Do you know what that is? And as Christians, we may get into this a little bit, but we have to ask: is leadership so culturally understood, and does the Bible have something to say that maybe transcends culture, that at least may speak into how we evaluate good leadership versus bad leadership? Um, so we're talking today in this conversation a little bit about failure, success, failure, which you've already mentioned a little bit about success and all that. So what prompted you to construct this theology of failure?
Yeah. I think it was really early on in my ministry that I realized um, there wasn't I couldn't wrap my mind around like what I was going to do day in and day out, right? And coming to the recognition that I could go in and do pretty much the same thing on Tuesday as I did on Monday. And Tuesday I walked away feeling like what am I doing? Like, this is terrible. And on Monday, walking away from basically doing the exact same thing, but feeling really like energized and like excited and like, oh, this was a successful, like productive day for me. And recognizing that and reflecting, I think, on why that was. What was the difference between Monday and Tuesday? And previously, before I started graduate school and ended up going to do ministry, which is sort of my vocation of calling since my sophomore year of college. I spent a year selling cars, and what I realized is that in car sales, you know when you're a success, right? In a sales manager's room, there's a whiteboard up there, and it has your name, and it has how many cars you've sold, right? And you can kind of compare yourself to other salespeople. You can see which cars you've sold, and you can look at the commissions that you've gotten. And those are all really strong ways of saying, hey, I'm successful. I've achieved, right? In school, I know I'm successful because I've gotten an A, right? And I received an A. The end, the culminating moment. Uh, the students of this class, you will receive a degree, and you will be successful, right? So we have this sort of sense of like what is success, but in ministry, what I found is um, those those markers are um, they're there. I just don't think they're healthy, right? So the markers of healthy of ministry is like, well, how many students did you have show up? Is your church growing numerically? How big is your budget? At your most recent event, how many students came? And then you get into this comparison game. And I realized that if I was going to play this comparison game, I was going to lose every single time, and I shouldn't be in ministry. Which got me reflecting on, so what is it to do ministry? What does it mean to be in leadership and ministry? And that drove me to doing some reading in terms of leadership and spiritual formation. Nouwen's book, In the Name of Jesus, I think was really a big catalyst for me in thinking about this theology of failure. He calls it irrelevance. A minister is supposed to be irrelevant, or in the 21st century. And I think that rang really true to me, that to do leadership or to do Christian leadership at some point is to suggest that following Jesus will render you irrelevant by all the other markers of success. And then what does that paint you then? Then you are technically a failure.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then how do you understand resurrection? How do you understand the presence of Jesus? The idea of hope in failure. And so it also, in my reading of theology, I've expanded my understanding of sort of the resurrection hope, right? And that idea of what, yes, after we die, resurrection, but also it being a lived reality of hope for the present.
Yeah, and I think uh, I know in some of our contemporary worship songs, we've gotten a little bit, we've expanded our understanding of resurrection victory to being kind of victories now. And so it can sometimes be difficult when we're talking about success and failure not to be obsessed with winning and kind of having that whiteboard and saying, you know, Jesus wants us to crush these goals. Jesus wants us to be successful because he's raised us from the dead now. And so how do we embrace resurrection hope, but also embrace the dying, the kind of I guess aging and limitations that that it means to be human, and the surrender that it means to, you know, as Jesus empties himself, he then is raised to, you know, to a success. But it's not. I think too often we're baptizing our cultural understandings of success with language from Scripture that maybe we don't understand quite as well as we should before we apply it. So there's we've talking a little bit about this scorecard. You've mentioned some of the things like how many students attended. I know in the past we've talked about it for our church movements. Is how many students have you baptized? How many baptisms do you have in your church every year? There's depending on what church tradition you're a part of, there's a lot of different kind of expectations on ministry and church leadership. um, so how does a theology of failure and this hope that you're kind of talking about change that scorecard? Like, does it eliminate the scorecard? Like, what does that look like? How does that reframe?
Yeah. So I think one of the things about the scorecard for success is that I don't really know if you can opt out of it, right? I think in some ways we are always um, determined or shaped by sort of where we are as a culture, as a society, and I think that's really kind of we see it even in our churches or the way that we kind of still play the comparison game, right? Well, you can't get a bunch of ministers together without sort of saying, well, how's your church doing? We're doing this and da da da. And it's like, oh, great. I mean, no one really comes into that and it's like, well, how's things going? You're like, not great. Like, we lost 20 members and like we're, I offended someone with my prophetic message the other day. Like, so we, by definition, are shaped to kind of highlight the what's going on, right? Even if everything's falling apart, we're gonna highlight this. So uh, what I mean, but I think a theology of failure can invite us to recontextualize it, or maybe bring us to a moment of sort of honesty, if not with other ministers, but with ourselves, of simply saying, um, this isn't working, right? This clearly isn't working, and I can spin it. I can kind of give it an optimistic outlook, but on some level, it's okay with saying this was a failure or this did not succeed the way that I wanted to. And I think there's great growth in that. Right. It sounds cliche because it is, but how many people have heard like you know, the Jordan quote, like, I missed every shot I didn't take, and it was like, so we talk about failure, right? As sort of and every successful person we know, every guru talks about failures, but we always talk about it in a way that's sort of like, well, you have to fail to get there. And what we really want to do is just get there. And what we don't realize is that God is in the failure, right? And the only way that you can maybe get to that success is by being honest about the failure and also being realistic that there may not be a success. Like, it just may be a failure. You may not actually grow the church. The church might implode. Things might end. I think in terms of like businesses, it might fail, right? But the hope um, of what, as I read scripture, is to say that it's in the death of things that we meet God, right? So that I think Lutherans really have a much better, more robust theology of the cross than like my tradition does, and I think some other traditions. But I think there's something really significant about the cross being part of the narrative of Jesus, and the failure, right? And again, if they found cultural expectations, there are at least some who expected Jesus to be the military leader to overthrow the Roman government. Well, he failed, right? And so if that's the case, then maybe the I think it goes back to that question of like, okay, how do you define success and failure, right? What are those markers? What's your moral vision? What's your good? Because Jesus was on message, right? Jesus went to the cross. Jesus knew what was going on. That's what he did. Even though by all these other markers, these scorecards, he was a failure. Failure in the eyes of his disciples on the cross. Failure in the eyes of the Jewish leaders and the Roman government. So there was this failure um, um, label, but uh, because we live when we do, we are like, whoa, no, they just got it wrong. Jesus was successful because Jesus was God's son and Jesus did what Jesus was sent to do. So I think that's, again, that idea of moral vision. But you can't, I think that's the theology of failure has given me the opportunity of saying, okay, can I now recontextualize those scorecards for successes? And then can I also then be really honest by the fact that I'm failing by all of these others markers that have been given to me? And can I be okay with that?
Yeah, no, I think that's helpful. I mean, there's a lot to digest in there. So as you're thinking, our class is a biblical theology of leadership. Um, as you think of a little bit about, like you were talking about Jesus there specifically, is there a key biblical text that kind of has informed this understanding for you? Maybe even as you've developed it over time, maybe there's a passage, or it could just be what you just mentioned about Jesus. I know that was powerful.
Yeah, to me, the prophets, when I look at the prophetic books and like Isaiah and Amos, um, you know, they failed in their mission to turn the people back to God, right? And yet they very clearly have a mandate, right? You talk about, uh, you know, Amos, I think it's in chapter 7. Amaziah comes to Amos and is like, "Get out of here! You're causing trouble." And there's this contest between Amos and Amaziah, and just recognizing that Amos fails. Like the people go into exile, total failure, and yet did Amos succeed in doing what God called Amos to do, which was to be faithful to the word that was given to Amos? And Amos says, look, I'm not a paid prophet, right? I don't come from a prophetic school. I was a dresser. I was like an agricultural worker in Tekoa. And the only reason why I'm here is because God has called me to this moment to speak these words. And knowing that it's not successful, I mean, in the historical context, the northern kingdom of Israel falls to the Assyrians, right? And so how do we reconcile this sort of word from God, this plead through the prophets that ultimately fail, and yet, you know, Amos was successful. He was faithful to the word that God had given him. So the prophetic books have been really significant in sort of really thinking through, okay, what does it mean? What is it going to mean to me to be successful in my leadership roles? And it goes back to that idea of moral vision, right? If I have a clear picture of what God has called me to do in this moment, then I can sort of say all the other scorecards matter. I'm not saying that they're not without merit. I'm not saying you can't pay attention to them, or I don't pay attention to them, but it does allow me to recontextualize them and say they don't matter as much as my sort of ultimate goal of where I'm going. And I think, I don't think I don't assume that the students in this course are going into ministry, but I think that same idea of what is your stated goal to go into whatever profession that you're going into, right? Is it to make X amount of dollars? Is it to impact for good? Those kinds of things. And those don't necessarily have to be against each other, but ultimately the question is, which one matters more, right? For you as a leader, all right? We live in a culture that says money equals success, right? If you can do good, great. And we have a lot of companies who are saying they're doing good and making a ton of money, right? At this point. But the question is, if you had to make the choice, which one are you going to make? And then I think that speaks to your sort of your moral vision or what you consider most good. And then it really talks about your own sort of internal definition of success and what that really looks like.
Yeah, well, and we've talked in the class already about how God is in the disruptions, and how God's spirit in the prophets, especially, is disrupting the kind of powers that be and the societal measures of success, and even the sense of security and peace. So God is the one named by the prophets as bringing Babylon and raising Babylon up to you basically bring justice to the land. And he's going to use this unjust kingdom basically to set right the score of how things have not been right. And Jerusalem, the prophets in Jerusalem were saying, no, it's going to be okay. We're taking a deep dive into Jeremiah early on in this class, and so it's sometimes a little bit like when we read the Bible, and I think this is what the prophets in Jerusalem were doing. They were reading the promises to the Davidic dynasty and saying, God's going to keep his promise. And so God's not going to allow Babylon to do this. And so we should align with Egypt or, whatever. We're going to protect this, and it's going to be okay, because the scriptures that we're interpreting are kind of confirming our bias towards everything's going to be okay here in Jerusalem, even after the first, kind of exile, the first, at least, initial exilic moment. And Jeremiah is saying, no, in fact, it's the hand of God doing this. Yeah. So for you, as you read biblical texts, I think it's pretty difficult. You've already mentioned a little bit. It's like pretty difficult for us to live within the context of the first century Christians who were seeing Jesus crucified and him failing at what they expected him to do. I mean, for us, we have this confirmation bias and all these cultural addendas that come and are handed down to us in forms of church tradition and other things. So how are you doing good study and interpretive work when you read the Bible, so that you don't just get caught in kind of that web of your own bias?
Yeah, I mean, what a big question, right? In terms of how you want to go about doing that. I mean, I think in some ways I benefit from having gone to seminary, having taken courses on exegesis and like critical readings of scripture, which kind of becomes the foundation for my ability to do that now in my current state. I think one of the ways that I am trying to read through, not through my own sort of biases or my cultural agendas, is to read authors who are making commentaries or are making suggestions that are not within my context, right? And so that's maybe reading for me specifically like Korean theology, right? And hearing how a Korean theologian is reading the text and seeing insights in it from a different cultural perspective. And that's been really helpful to me in terms of sort of, okay, how do I see this differently? I think even in our current world, reading Black theologians who are going to look at things differently. And I just did a sermon on the Ethiopian eunuch, and I read the commentary by Dr. Willie James Jennings, a Black scholar and theologian, and his insight into that passage is very different than what the insight that I grew up hearing, which was that story is about baptism. And Jennings goes, no, that story is about the eunuch and the expanding nature of God's kingdom that's inclusive beyond sort of identity and locates the identity of the eunuch, right? So maybe I could get to that from reading other authors, but I think there's something significant about reading someone from a very different lived experience than the one that I've had. The other thing is I've really started paying attention to like the translation of the Bible I'm reading. So I pretty much read the Common English Bible, and one of the reasons why I've done that, shifted to that translation, is that their editors, their translators, is the most diverse translating board for any sort of English translation, right? So they have, Asian, uh, American scholars and women and men, and just across the board. And I think that matters. I think reading through that study Bible versus like, the one that I grew up with, the New International Version, has helped me sort of challenge those agendas and cultural
It's funny
biases.
that the New International Version isn't as international as
Right,
the Common
right,
English, but
right.
you're right. And I've adopted the Common English Bible, and one of the textbooks that we have used for this class uses quotes primarily from the Common English Bible, and so I'm hopeful students will engage with different translations as a helpful practice. It's helpful to hear how
I
you're
also
doing that.
think
Yeah, go
like
ahead.
like it matters what questions that we bring to the text,
Mhm.
right? So I teach this Old Testament course, and one of the things that I keep asking my students is to be aware of is what questions are you asking? And then once you identify the questions, then ask the question of what's at stake for you as a reader, right? Why are you asking that question? Because if we don't reflect on the questions that we're asking, um, I don't think we begin to ask different questions. And I think asking different questions of the text matters, right? So even as leaders, what if we go to if you want to build a biblical theology of leadership, great. What are the questions that you're asking of that text, right? And are you asking the right questions, or are you asking more of the biblical text than the biblical text can give you, right? Like Psalms. I love the book of Psalms. I'm not sure you're going to find a great biblical mandate for leadership from the book of Psalms. You're going to find some great poetic language. You're going to find the freedom to use metaphor to talk about God and a variety of other things. But I can't tell you that that's going to be like the book that you should look at for a biblical theology of leadership. So, what questions are you asking? What texts are you reading? Um, I think matter in sort of that development.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. We've given some opportunity to do some biblical exegesis and interpretive work, and bring our questions to the text. But it's so hard to know how we're submitting ourselves to it as the from a Christian perspective in this class is that the Bible is the highest authority by which we evaluate leadership and other things in our life. Um, at the same point, you're so right. Without doing that critical reflection, we may be bringing agendas and demands to the text that the text is not actually asking. My dad used to use a phrase when we were doing communion thoughts mostly, but any sort of devotional thought. He said that you need to ask the question, what is the text demanding to be said? And I found out really quickly that it was easy for me to insert what Lars was demanding the text to say. It was much harder to know, without some of these other tools and helpful people. You were describing kind of listening to other authors, and that's one of the invitations of this class was to see alterity, and just seeing the other people in our life and treating them as subjects and not objects.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, this class is asking the question, how do we do that with God? How do we see God not as just kind of a passive object of our desire to join with our agendas or something, but as an active agent, an active subject in the unfolding of history? Not what one of the authors calls functional atheism, which is a lot of what Charles Taylor and stuff deals with in his work. So as we kind of come to a close here, I wanted to give you just a moment to kind of talk a little bit about some of the challenges specifically that you faced in your leadership context in your ministry. We read through the book of Acts and noticed how, in response to these challenges and things not going well, persecutions and other things, the church really had to improvise. You know, Peter was a vision comes down, and then Cornelius invites him to come, and he's got these failures of like can't reach the Jews, but here's a Gentile, and he's got to improvise. He's not sure what to do. So, can you speak to some moments when you feel like you've been uh, when you've had to improvise?
Yeah, I mean, I think ministry by definition is improvisation, right? Like we don't, you might sort of set off in a direction and kind of head that way, but something happens, members don't show up, there's a big disagreement about some sort of really big doctrinal issue that you had no idea anyone cared a rip about. And those are real frustrating moments. And I think you improvise. It's cliche again, but people say like ministry is what happens in the interruptions, right? It's what they say. It's like the Spirit is kind of bringing forward what um, comes up. I think too many times people use that line as an excuse for not doing the work that they're supposed to be doing. It's like, oh, well, I was supposed to write the sermon, but interruptions, that's where the ministry is. And, my friend called me and said I had baseball tickets to go to the game. And, I hadn't talked to them and I was trying to evangelize. And you're kind of like, yeah, it sounds like you just wanted to go to a baseball game with your buddy and you just wanted to bathe it in sort of like whatever sort of Christian language you wanted to do in that. Um, and that's not to say that ministry can't happen in the interruptions. I just think we have to be aware of how we use that language, right? And kind of think in terms of improvisation, because if all we do is improvise in leadership, then I think you're just going to burn yourself out because you're going to go 100 different ways and it's not going to make any kind of sense. And I think, again, it comes back to the question of moral vision of where you're headed. Does this sort of move you in the direction? And I think when I think about what I'm doing in ministry, there's rarely a season where someone doesn't come to me with a good idea, right? Of something that I need to do as a minister, that the ministry that I lead needs to do. And I've had to really think about, do I say yes to that? Do I improvise and can I make room for it? Sometimes. Do I say no to it and say it just doesn't fit, right? And so in the improvisation, am I still looking towards that goal of where I think God is calling me to head towards? I think that's kind of the big overarching idea when I think about improvisation. Trying to think just in the small things. Like I don't know if I've ever run up against such a big event that I've had to been like, oh, I have to reorient everything and just do things completely different. I do think job transition is probably one of those improvising moments where you felt like I'm going to be here for forever. And then give me a minute, bud. You're going to be there forever. And then the Spirit prompts you, right? And the Spirit says, this isn't going to be the place that you're going to be, or you get fired or whatever happens. Right. And so you get moved into the liminal moment of transition. And then you have to improvise, right? You have to adapt. You have to be willing to say, okay, this or okay, that. I've been at a church that every moment where I'm like, I'm finally going to get like the foundation for kids. Like this next group of kids have like 10 kids. And like, this is the foundation that the youth ministry is going to be built upon. Something's happened and I've lost 4 or 5 of those kids. They've moved away. The church made a choice and someone didn't like it. So they went to another church. And I'm going through this process again, where I have this crop of incoming sixth graders and this family who has been so important to our church over the last 15 years and our children's ministry. And I was like, man, they're awesome. Like they're committed and they're moving, you know? And so I got to improvise. I got to think about, okay, they're not going to be there. So what does that mean? Right. Any plans that I had with them coming into the youth ministry or changes. I think even I I think there's going to be more work on my plate because some of the big projects they did, like our fall festival, well, someone's got to do it. And what probably will happen is I will be invited to take over that role in some way. So those are all parts of it. And I can be again. Um, I have to determine whether or not that fits sort of my ultimate vision for where the ministry is supposed to go. And then have the courage to have those conversations with people of saying, yes, I'm willing to improvise because it fits that, or no, I'm not willing to improvise here because this is where we're headed, right? And this doesn't fit. And have those awkward conversations. And I think that's where it's important to have the leadership skills, right? And to have a good sense of who you are as a leader to have those conversations.
Yeah, in our discussion of improvisation, we're kind of talking a little bit about the idea that who you are, your character, what God is developing in you, and how you're developing and knowing yourself is, you know, how you're going to be successful in those moments where you have to improvise. And maybe successful isn't the right term, but to go where God is wanting you to go. And then the other part of it, obviously, naming God's leadership, um, and trusting the Spirit rather than trying to control or manage the outcomes. And I think that's really hard, really difficult. Like as you're talking about families moving and leaving. Well, we have kids that are anxious to have our presence, so we're going to wrap up. And maybe this is a perfect way to end.
Yeah.
Theology of failure is that I'm failing to get my little one to be
Oh,
calm.
there she is.
Yeah, there she is. Well, Zach, thank you for spending the last almost hour with us.
Yeah, no problem.
And you know, many blessings on your leadership and ministry in the next year. And thank you for speaking some words of wisdom to us.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.